Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the pre-conference symposium, Special Forces, Special Operations in World War II. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here in New Orleans. This is our 12th year of offering the pre-conference symposium as an opportunity for those who have the interest and the time to make this wonderful weekend even longer and more enriching. Now, having seen how you all came through the doors this morning, I know everyone's excited. You all have become some of our most loyal supporters of the conference, symposia, our travel programs, and many other opportunities the museum is pleased to offer. Thank you very much. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge two World War II veterans with us today, Paul Hilliard, Norman Miller up front. Also give a round of thanks and appreciation to all our active duty military, vets of any era and their families. Thank you for what you've done for our country. And a quick shout out to our trustees and our Patriot Circle and Charter members. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So let's give them a round of applause as well. Now, as a special thank you to all of you for being here for our pre-conference symposium, it's my pleasure and distinct privilege to have you be the first to hear about an exciting new museum initiative that the Jenny Craig Institute is honored to advance. In recognition of the many important and engaging books published on the subject of World War II history each year, and as a way to recognize and reward those works and their authors, the museum will be presenting on an annual basis the National World War II Museum Book Awards. Now, those awards will recognize the most outstanding English language, nonfiction books in World War II history published each year. The awards are in two categories, the best book and the best debut book. The Museum Book Awards will help promote and shape the field of World War II historical research, expand its audience, and support authors in their scholarly endeavors. The best debut book in World War II history will recognize an excellent book on World War II from a first-time published author with a prize of $10,000. But wait, there's more. The best book in World War II history award will recognize the top book on World War II of the year and carries a prize of $50,000. Now, each award category will have its own selection committee consisting of leading scholars in the field of World War II history who will review publisher-submitted nominees. The committees will look for work with scholarly merit, integrity of research, overall readability, originality, and consider how does it make a distinguished contribution to our understanding of World War II. The first awards will be for those books published in the 2026 calendar year, and they'll be announced early in 2027. It is our hope that the book awards connect the museum's audience of lifelong learners to the field of World War II historical research and a vast community of experts who continue to discover new stories from the war. Ultimately, the goal of the Book Awards is to encourage greater interest in and understanding of World War II history. Now, there will be more details given tonight, but we wanted you to be the very first to hear it. So, look forward to that. Now, on to our program. The opening session of Special Forces and Special Operations in World War II Symposium has been selected as the General Raymond D. Mason Distinguished Lecture on World War II. The Mason Lecture Series is devoted to the legacy of America's largest war. Past speakers have included writers, scholars, distinguished members of the armed forces, and journalists. The lecture series is made possible by the generosity of the late Major General and Mrs. Raymond D. Mason, Jr., and the Raymond D. Mason Foundation. Mason served in the ETO during World War II in the 4th Armored Division of General George Patton's 3rd Army. and prior to retiring from the military in 1976, he held several high-ranking Pentagon positions. To give our Mason lecture is our best-selling author and friend of the museum, Patrick K. O'Donnell. Now, Patrick is a critically acclaimed military historian and one of the world's leading authorities on special operations forces and elite units. Patrick is the best-selling author of 14 books, recounting stories of America's wars from the Revolution to Iraq, including The Unvanquished, The Brenner Assignment, and Operatives, Spies, and Saboteurs. The last two books, having formed the basis of a special tour Patrick will be leading with our very own Dr. Nick Mueller next fall. Now, Patrick's most recent national award-winning books include The Indispensables and Washington's Immortals. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Patrick O'Donnell.
It's an honor to be here today, and it's so great to see many old friends from, France and elsewhere, as well as historian friends. For me, it's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be able to listen and tell the stories of World War II veterans, which I started 35 years ago. And I've interviewed thousands of veterans in the elite units that are in this symposium only, and the men that they fought against. Began with the Airborne, 82nd, 101st, all the independent units, 509, 551st, 517, and then the Rangers. Last night we were talking about the Rangers' first action, Darby's Rangers' first action, where 50 American Rangers landed on Dieppe. Our first casualty, our first death was at Dieppe. I interviewed the surviving members of the Rangers from that raid. There were about 5 or 6, 7 men in the 90s. My arc of work is 14 books that begin with the American Revolution. I have 3 in that. It's all about special operations forces, irregular warfare that spans the Civil War leading up into World War I and World War II, Korean War, and the Battle of Fallujah, where I was a volunteer combat historian that fought with the Marine Corps in a special operations unit as well as the assault force that went into the city. For me, this is a very personal topic because it's about the men and women that imparted their stories and trusted me with their stories. What I will say after, over 3 decades of work in this topic, irregular warfare and special operations is part of American DNA, going back before this country was even founded. With Benjamin Church, for instance, marking ranging forces or Rangers in 1570 to go against the Native Americans and combat their irregular warfare tactics. Much of this is based on combating Native Americans and developing tactics and doctrine to combat that. And what we find is there's a unique set of warfare that is developed, but it's very much like a sine curve. Once things are developed, they are then lost. They are developed and lost. In today's parlance, we are not a learning organization where we retain a lot of the doctrine. I think we're getting better, but it's still a problem. And let me go back, take you back in time to 1940, 1941, when the United States did not possess special operations forces. It was at this time that an agency, a unique one, maybe one of the most unique in American history, something called the Coordinator of Information was formed. This would become the Office of Strategic Services 1 year later. Under the leadership, the dynamic leadership of Colonel Wild Bill Donovan, he would look to build an organization overnight. The model for an OSS candidate was a PhD who could win a bar fight. And they found extraordinary individuals, some of the most extraordinary individuals I've ever met, that could win a bar fight as a PhD. And they would do that overseas, and they would prove to be an incredibly potent and as professionals later after the war. But in 1941, Donovan had an uphill road, and he would write directly to the President of the United States that we need, in 1940, that we need to bring back the old guard, the Rangers and the Scouts, men that could sow the dragon's teeth, that could wreak havoc on the enemy. He convinced FDR, but he had a problem. There were no examples or lessons learned in the 20th century to look at. Where does he go? Wild Bill Donovan looks back at our first modern war, the American Civil War, and he looks back at three groups: the Confederate Secret Service, Mosby's Rangers, and a very obscure group called the Jesse Scouts. And the Jesse Scouts are named the Jesse Scouts because of Jessie Fremont, the wife of John C. Fremont, the pathfinder who used scouts to explore the West. But in 1861, they brought the scouts back, and they were inspired by Mrs. Fremont, who it's been said was a better man than her husband, because she was a dynamic woman that was amazing, that could hold court, that could confront President Lincoln directly. The men admired her, and it was probably her idea for them to do something more dangerous than any other scouts could do. That would be to wear a Confederate uniform behind enemy lines as Union Scouts. And that's exactly what these men did. And that's why many of them never came home. They received 7 medals of honor. Many of them they didn't receive. And it's a story, an epic story of men that led General Sheridan's armies and others to victory. At Appomattox, they are the ones that capture or seize General Lee's supply trains. One of the great untold stories of the Civil War is our war in Mexico. In 1861, France conquered Mexico, and there were about 40 to 50,000 French troops on the border in Mexico that were aiding the Confederacy. We did not want direct action. This becomes our first proxy war against a European power. The Jesse Scouts are sent in to arm the resistance, to create chaos. They act much like today's special operators. And tragically, many of these men never come home, including their commanding officer, Henry Young. They disappear. And the story is lost in time. Within that arc, though, these men fought against the South's most dangerous men. Mosby, John Singleton Mosby and his Rangers would pioneer a shadow warfare. Another layer, though, beyond that, were operations so sophisticated that they could easily be today, and that would be with the Confederate Secret Service. Another lost story. They invent information operations to influence the press, for instance, to convince the population, which is restless after hundreds of thousands of casualties, that there's a forever war. They have an insurrection, arguably one of the first insurrections that we see, stuff that we see today that is uncorked. And you also have political assassination and many other things. The Secret Service was way ahead of its time. And it would be Donovan that would form this nascent organization. And it was made up of really unique individuals. At its core was something that had never been done, which is a research and analysis branch where he would take the experts of the world, PhDs from the great universities of America, that were experts on specific aspects of European or Asian history, and they would become analysts to take the data that was taken from the field and turn it into potentially actionable or strategic intelligence. And this group of individuals studied the Civil War and its operations to distill the lessons learned that could be incorporated into the OSS. And most importantly, within this organization were the formation of special operations forces, irregular forces that would directly conduct unconventional warfare, specifically arming guerrillas, training them, conducting sabotage, information operations, psychological operations. They had a research and analysis branch that did all the spy gadgets of a modern James Bond movie in Q's laboratory. And within this realm, overnight, this agency was forming. And it would be, the first branch of that would be something called the Special Activities Branch. They named it such because we were not at war at the time, and it had to be sort of an innocuous term. It becomes the Special Operations Branch. And within this branch, really incredible things begin to happen. I'm going to walk through a few of these examples. One, in December 1941, 6 Italian frogmen riding submersible vehicles would hit Alexandria Harbor, and overnight would conduct an underwater Pearl Harbor, which would sink 2 British battleships. Instantly, there was an arms race to develop the technology that they had utilized, underwater rebreathers, to attack the British. The United States was the furthest behind, and they looked upon the OSS to come up with a solution. And it's here that something called part of the Special Operations Branch called the Maritime Authority is formed, which becomes the Maritime Unit. And overnight, practically, the technology is what forms the unit. And one of the most extraordinary individuals is a young PhD student, medical student, Christian Lambertson from the University of Pennsylvania. He'd been working on scuba or rebreathers for years, had taken a gas mask and a bicycle pump and developed one of the first rebreathers. And he perfected it over time. And it's this week, in 1942, if you go to the Omni Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C., the OSS needed to find a place to test the rebreather. And the Shoreham Hotel had the largest pool in Washington, D.C. And it was here that the rebreather is tested, and it's the birth of the precursor to the U.S. Navy SEALs. And it's here that Lambertson develops the dive tables that we now know to prevent the bends. They develop specialized equipment like swim fins, dive watches. They have motorized surfboards and mattresses that agents can go into behind the lines. And it's here that one of the first operatives from the Maritime Unit tests the rebreather, an extraordinary individual, Jack Taylor. And Taylor is 33 years old. He's an adventurer, but he's also an orthodontist. He joins the OSS, and this extraordinary individual tests the equipment, and Taylor is the perfect man for the job. He's joined as he goes overseas. He's one of the first Maritime Unit operatives to go overseas. They land in Cairo, which is an area that swarms with Axis spies, but also they operate in the Eastern Mediterranean. Picture the guns of Navarone, small boats. Taylor is delivering arms and supplies to the Greek resistance that the OSS is helping fomate and supply. They move to Italy, and it's here that the OSS conducts really an extraordinary rescue operation. There are a number of nurses, about 30, and a doctor that has crash landed in a C-46 behind the lines in Albania. And Taylor and a famous person, Sterling Hayden, who joins the OSS as a Marine, they go behind the lines and they rescue the nurses. It's a two-part mission. I interviewed the individual that they sent in the second time with only a 357 Magnum and a letter from President Roosevelt. His name was Lloyd Smith. And I'll never forget, he put the pistol on the table when I interviewed him, and he said, "This was Sterling Hayden's pistol that I won in a poker game." And Smitty, as he was called, was also, this guy was extraordinary, but you'd never know it. After the war, he became an accountant, very mild-mannered, but we immediately hit it off because we were both Division I wrestlers at one point. And he rescued the nurses, along with Taylor and Hayden. But Jack wasn't done. In fact, he wanted to be part of the deepest missions behind the lines that OSS had. And he's part of a mission to penetrate into Austria. And the OSS is very, very novel in their techniques and approaches. There are not enough individuals that know the terrain of Austria, that can speak the language. So they recruit what's known as deserter volunteers for the mission. And these are former German POWs that are brought into the mission. And they drop behind the lines in Austria to conduct intelligence. But the most vital and important aspect of any operation behind the lines is the radio. And the radio, it was never found. So this team was behind the lines, being hunted by the SS with no radio. And eventually they were rolled up a month later. And it's here that the men, and Taylor in particular, endures some of the most difficult experiences of World War II for an American. He's thrown into Mauthausen concentration camp and builds the crematorium brick by brick. He's on the death list every day, but through a friendly individual and other sources, he's able to evade that and is eventually liberated. But Jack Taylor doesn't go home, even though he went from about 180 pounds to 115 or 120 pounds. He's a walking skeleton. But he gathered war crimes evidence against the SS and eventually became a witness in the trials afterwards. That's one example of the OSS. Another example are the special operations groups, the OGs. And Dr. Mueller and I are leading a tour next year, the Brenner assignment, Shadow War in the Dolomites, the real Inglorious Bastards next year, which is sold out. And it's based on the mission that I'm going to tell you about now, which the first Inglorious Bastards, if you will, was a German operational group is what it was called. And there were 5 members of that group that were refugees from Nazi Germany. They had fled there. Most of their families would be executed in the camps, and they wanted to go back for, in some cases, vengeance, but at least to try to do something in the war. And their mission is complex in the sense that they literally actually split off from the German operational group and they have their own missions, which is part of a book called They Dared Return. But this is some of the earliest special operations forces because they drop in by parachute to arm the resistance and conduct sabotage against bridges, vital installations like tunnels, and direct action against the Germans. They spread propaganda, they gather intelligence on the vital Brenner Pass and the sub-passes leading up to it, and they begin to disable traffic in the Dolomite region that feed the Brenner. An entire zone, the Germans create a free zone because they were so effective in blowing up all the bridges that they literally abandoned the area until they can bring on new troops. And those new troops are kind of an untold story, if you will. They're Cossacks from the steppes of Russia that are part of the SS, and they're very brutal to the population. Just one example of the OSS behind the lines, they capture at the end, they force the capture of thousands of SS and Wehrmacht troops. And it's in the hands of really only one individual, probably the toughest OSS veteran I ever interviewed, Howard Chappell. And I told a little bit of the story last year on how Chappell never wanted to be interviewed. Most of the individuals, the men and women of the OSS, maintained their vows of silence. These are not individuals that would go on a reality show and to tell their story. They kept it buried. I arrived at an OSS reunion over 25 years ago and started to, basically, they trusted me and imparted their stories. And Howard was an example of that, who had not told his story, who would always say to me, well, Pat, you got to come out to California. And it was kind of a blow-off line. I befriended his case officer, Albert Materazzi. His nickname was the Brain. He sent the missions behind the lines. And, we would sit on evenings and afternoons and, just eat pasta and look through his old files from the OSS that he gathered from the National Archives. But it was hundreds and hundreds of documents to sort of uncover this history. And I finally got the Brain to sort of triangulate my efforts with Howard. And I just went out to San Francisco, flew out there, and I said, Howard, I'd love to interview. He's like, well, Pat, you just need to come out here. And I'm like, I'm here. Next thing he said to me is, I said, I'd love to talk to you. He's like, all right, tomorrow at high noon at the golf station on Spyglass Road. No problem. Got there at 11:50, and right at noon, this Lincoln pulls up with like tinted windows, and he just looks over at me. He's like, follow me. Went back to his house, and he kind of had these Count Chocula nails, and he starts to sharpen his nails and open up mail with his Fairburn Sykes fighting knife. You need to go to the bathroom? I'm like, I'm fine. Brought him back to his war at a place called the Bushy Bridge. And this will be one of the first stops on our tour. It's here that Howard single-handedly takes out a bridge and 30 troops as well as 2 armored vehicles with a bazooka. It's an incredible story. But I remember asking him how he killed the first guard, and he's like, I don't remember if I used my knife or a silenced pistol. And then he remembered about how he was almost captured, and he literally killed a German officer with a ski pole. But as he was being captured, he escaped with a judo throw, and the guard had a Mauser rifle. And as he bolted off, before that he actually utilized what was known as a stinger, which is a .22 caliber ballpoint pen, and pointed it at the guard. And the guard just looked at him like, what the hell is that? And he threw it aside and then bolted off. And as he was bolting off, the Mauser fired, and it grazed his calf. And I'll never forget, he rolled up his leg, and the scar from that bullet was still there. But Howard Chappell is an example of an individual that used his personal agency to change history, much like many of the other members of the OSS. The Jedburgh teams are another group, 3-man teams, in most cases 2, sometimes 2, tri-national often, 1 American, 1 Brit, Frenchman, or sometimes someone from the Netherlands. These teams went in before D-Day, working with the SOE, our critical partner, to sow chaos, the dragon's teeth, to attack and vanish, in a split second, but to tie down massive numbers of troops. One of those individuals is Aaron Bank, who was one of the Jeds, along with William Colby. There were many others that would rise to prominence after the war. But the Jeds were extremely effective, and it would be here that things would blossom for Aaron Bank. He took deserter volunteers. One of his next missions was something called Operation Iron Cross, and this was a plan to actually kill Hitler or utilize a team of commandos, and those commandos would be deserter volunteers that Bank trained. The mission was scrubbed at the last minute because, obviously we'd overrun things, so it was superfluous. But it's just another example of the OSS, really, pioneering many aspects of irregular warfare. With the OSS were the history of America's special operations is not a linear line, and it's kind of like a tree in a way. The OSS being maybe the trunk, but there are many branches of that tree that are also very critically important. And let me talk about some of the other individuals that I interviewed. And first and foremost, it would be the U.S. Army Rangers, who I have a tremendous fondness for. I interviewed all of the original, those that were surviving in the 90s, of Darby's Rangers, the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the 5th, as well as the 6th. Robert Prince from the 6th Ranger Battalion and the raid on Cabanatuan was a very good friend. But it was Darby's Rangers that I really started out with. And I will never forget, I interviewed Lester Kness, and Les was just a tough guy in his 60s when I interviewed him. And I'll never forget talking to him about, they had a raid at Sened Station, which was an Italian outpost in the middle of a desert, in the middle of nowhere. And the Rangers were sent on foot on a forced march, armed with their knives, to basically raid and attack Sened Station. And they did it. They pulled off an amazing raid, an operation. They utilized their knives for the most part and stealthily disappeared. And it was shortly after that that General Patton was relieved of command, took over command of Friednall, and it would be the Rangers that would guard Patton. And Les was one of those, along with Frank Mattivi and others. And they had just gotten off the raid, and Patton personally reprimanded them for not having their neckties. And I'll never forget, they were so furious that they had they'd killed men with their bare hands. They had done everything that their country had asked, and this guy is reprimanding them for not having neckties, and they were dirty because of the raid. And he told me, we were going to frag Patton. They were serious. Didn't happen, thank God. And then I asked him, I said, Les, are you the greatest generation? He said to me, no, Pat. What about the boys of 1775 and 1776 that believed in the cause? That was the greatest generation. Just self-effacing, they are a great generation, an amazing generation. And I would befriend many of these Rangers over time. And I'll never forget, one of the issues that any author deals with is, what's next? What's the next book? And I'll never forget, it was 2000, I want to say about 8 or 9, maybe 8 or 9, and it may 2007. And I was up in the Jersey Shore. I'm not sure why. I was on a date, and I found myself there. And after the date, and I was at Pizza Hut. And I'm like, what on earth am I doing here for one. And I said to myself, what is the next book going to be? So I was near Len Lamel's home, who's a very good friend. And I just called him up that morning. I said, Len, I'd love to stop by. I'm up here. He's like, sure, come on over. So we sat and watched a Yankees game. And I told him my dilemma. It's like all of the 14 books that I've written. They find me. And Len said to me, Pat, you need to do Dog Company. And Dog Company is about Dog Company of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, the boys of Pointe du Hoc. And it's Len Lamel who, their mission is to take out the 6 big guns on Pointe du Hoc, which is a fortress. It's mined with IEDs. It's a cliff that's 90 feet tall. They have to scale it under direct fire. It's Len that is a first sergeant at the time, scales the cliff, gets a bullet on his side from a machine gun and keeps going, follows the tire tracks. The guns aren't up on the top and the casements like they were perceived to be because there's telephone poles there. But Len follows the tire tracks, takes out several bunkers along with one of his men, and they find 5 of the guns and disable them with thermite grenades. It's an example of individuals being at the right time, at the right place, and their personal agency will change the course of events. The Rangers of the 5th Ranger Battalion, it's the same circumstance. They're supposed to reinforce Lamel in the 3 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion on Pointe du Hoc, but they go to their secondary objective through an odd sequence of events, including a radio transmission that doesn't go through, and they then land on Omaha Beach. They're supposed to land in Dog Green, but the commanding officer makes an audible. They land in Dog White, and they help lead the breakout from bloody Omaha Beach. Rangers lead the way comes from that beachhead, which is so bloody. Then proceeded to interview many of the other. I'm not going to be able to cover, with the time that I have, all of the units that I interviewed, the men that I interviewed, and the importance that many of these other units have. I also interviewed many of the Marine Raiders. The Raiders have a very interesting story. The president's son is an executive officer at the 2nd Raider Battalion with Evans Carlson. He was originally a member of the OSS and worked directly with Wild Bill Donovan. So some of the knowledge was transferred over. But the Raiders have a very interesting dynamic. The 1st Raider Battalion is under Mike Edson, Mike Edson, who's a very traditional Marine officer and a very good Marine officer. The other is Evans Carlson, who spends time as an observer with Mao Zedong's forces in China and is really very, the term gung-ho comes from Carlson. He has a very different ethic and way of leading compared to Edson. But these forces, specifically the 1st Raider Battalion, become the right men at the right time, at the right place on Bloody Ridge in September 1942, where they, in the 1st Parachute Battalion, other members I interviewed, are the only thing standing between the Japanese and the airfield and overrunning it, potentially. And it's through their actions in the foxholes, men like Captain John Sweeney, who I interviewed, that would give their all. Many of their men would lose their lives that night to repel the attack on the airfield, but they are successful. The other unit that I had a lot of interaction with is the 1st Special Service Force, a really incredible unit. It's joint Canadian. There are Canadian paratroopers as well as Americans. There will be individuals talking about them in much greater depth, but it's all part of something called the Plow Project, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Pike, who had envisioned destroying 14 hydroelectric stations in Norway with commandos. These men train for sabotage and a hit-and-run mission. They have a specialized vehicle called a Weasel that they utilize for Arctic operations. It's all kind of for naught, though. The mission gets canceled, and you now have a very elite force that they try to find a place for. And first, it's in the Aleutians at Kiska, where there are no Japanese. They land to take the island, which they successfully do, and then they move immediately towards Italy. And it's here that they are a breakthrough unit. At La Defensa, the Gothic line, the German defensive belts in the mountains are practically impenetrable, and it's the force that leads the breakthrough there. They fight at Anzio. They're part of the 1st Airborne Task Force in southern France, and then they are disbanded not long after fighting in the mountains of southern France. The common theme of all of these books is individuals with personal agency that can change the course of events. And that holds true then and today. And what we saw, my favorite quote is from one of the original Glorious Bastards. My very dear friend, Fred Mayer, who is a German refugee that organizes his own mission with 3 other individuals, including 1 deserter volunteer, a true hero who goes back behind the lines on the glacier near Innsbruck, Austria, and they penetrate. Fred is Jewish, but wears a German officer's uniform, and really conducts some great intelligence work that leads to the destruction of multiple trains that are, the Allied Air Corps destroys by bombing mission thanks to Fred's intelligence. Literally helps liberate a city, forcing the surrender of hundreds of SS troops and protecting civilians in the process. Very extraordinary story. One of my favorite lines from Fred was, "If you don't risk, you don't win." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. If you all raise your hands, Connie and I will bring the microphone to you. Patrick, first question is straight ahead, halfway back.
A great presentation.
Thank you.
Just wanted to, heard years ago that Sterling Hayden kind of dabbled with communism. I guess when he was doing his bit in Yugoslavia and over there, and kind of was was tempted to become a communist. Or could you talk a little bit about that?
I don't believe that's probably a myth. One of the things that was a great honor for us was when I went to the Shoreham Hotel. I was the first person to find the pool, and it's now the Empire Room. If you go down the steps of the Shoreham, you'll see the Empire Room, but next to it is a plaque that talks about the testing the rebreather, and there's mention of Sterling Hayden. And at the dedication, we had his son show up to say a few words. And it was a really tremendous and remarkable event. He talked about his father and how after the war he sailed around the world and with them as well. He struggled with the demons of war, like many veterans. But Sterling Hayden was an amazing hero and an amazing actor.
Next question, we're going to go all the way to your right, about halfway down.
Thank you. I have 2 personal questions. First of all, At the Jersey Shore, why would you go to a Pizza Hut?
That's a really great question. That's
Really?
kind of where I was going with that whole thing.
Oh,
It's
man.
like, what am I doing here?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's Manco and Manco if you're in the Jersey Shore.
You know, I hear you.
Okay, second question is, just curious personally, how did you get involved in this? What was your interest? Did you have family members, a father, grandfather who served in World War II?
My interest started when I was 4 years old, and I have been obsessed with World War II and military history ever since then. When other kids were reading dinosaur books, I was going to the library with this massive. I remember one of the first books I read was this massive tome of photo history of World War I. And I'm probably only 35 pounds, 40 pounds or whatever at that time, and the book was 10 pounds. But it grew and grew, and I was taking my parents to battlefields. It's been a lifelong obsession, but also a passion. And I haven't worked for 27 years as a full-time author or historian. This is what I love to do. And yes, we had some family members, but it's just something that's always been there for me. And I love to learn. And, you know, some people have asked me why. You know, all the books that I've written have a common theme of special operations, elite units. But I also love to learn new time periods and you see the commonalities, but each one is a journey, and each one finds me, just like the dog company with Len Lamel.
Next question's going to go to Bob, all the way in the front to your right, please, Patrick.
I had something to do out in Montana with some veterans of and they were the direct descendants of the first trench. Robert, what's his name? The guy that trained them. Robert.
Are you talking about Fairburn for the OSS?
No, I'm talking about for the first Army.
Okay. You're talking about for the first Special Service Force guys.
First, yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm 88.
You're talking about General Fredericks?
General Fredericks. I read a book, and it said that, and you'd mentioned it, that they were to get hydroelectric, and that was Churchill's, and it said it was Churchill's idea, and when he told, and it said that when he told the Norwegians, they had a fit. They said, "You'll ruin and kill everybody in our country." Is that true?
I think you're going to get, to some degree, but you'll get a much nuanced and better answer from the other panelists on that.
Okay.
We're going to go center aisle.
Hi, thank you. You were talking about personal agency and how important that is. Could you kind of expand on that, about what you see as personal agency and why it's so important?
I think it's the for the OSS, for instance, it's the PhD that can win a bar fight. It's the person that thinks out of the box, that sometimes breaks an order to do an extraordinary thing, that doesn't know their own limitations. And what you see through history, you see it through history all over the place, how a small group of individuals can change history. An example would be, I've written 3 books on the American Revolution. Washington's Immortals, for instance, where the small band of Marylanders were at the right time, at the right place, an hour more important in our history than any other, an American Thermopylae at the Battle of Brooklyn, where in many cases the flower of Maryland society, some of the wealthiest individuals sacrificed themselves. They're the only unit, one of the only units in the Battle of Brooklyn that have bayonets, and they attack a fixed position against General Cornwallis. But that sacrifice allows a large bulk of the army to escape and fight another day. Another example of personal agency, only a few days later, is John Glover and the Marblehead Men, that pull off the American Dunkirk when given only a few hours' notice to gather all of the ships, or in this case, small boats, to somehow transport over 9,000 Americans along with their equipment, horses, and the wounded across the East River, which is a swirling mess because of the nor'easter that took place the day before. They somehow do it through their personal agency and change the course of history and save Washington's army in one of the greatest evacuations in military history.
Patrick, we're going to stay right next to Mary.
Hello. Just first of all, I want to start off by making a comment. What would possess you to eat at a Pizza Hut at any place? But this is basically, or generally touched on earlier, but do you have any stories of, agents working, closely with resistance movements and partisans, or develop any relationships with them, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, the OSS is replete with their activity. They conduct unconventional or regular warfare. They train many of the partisans that form resistance movements. And I mean, one element of that is once you create a resistance movement that's trained, it's your goal, as John Singleton Mosby in the Civil War would later expand upon, was to tie up as many German troops or Axis troops as you could, just to hunt you. And that wasn't necessarily the bridges that you destroyed or the convoys you ambushed, but that act alone of just tying up, massive amounts of German soldiers or Axis soldiers, they're very successful. I mean, Eisenhower would later say that the resistance through the OSS and the SOE would contribute 15 divisions against the Germans during the invasion of, during the battle for France. So they play a crucial role, and then these individuals do maintain their friendships. Louis Koning, for instance, who was a Jed, would have deep ties with the Corsican Brotherhood and resistance, which they would fight with. And, fascinating stories of individuals that would maintain their friendships and relationships with people after the war.
We have a question all the way in the back to the right, Patrick.
Thank you. Can you expound on the deserter volunteers a little bit? You mentioned them several times. How did they find them? How did they vet them? What was that like?
What they would do, it's a really interesting aspect of World War II, which is technically outside of the Geneva Convention and probably illegal. The OSS was willing to bend the rules, though, to win the war. And they had a real critical shortage of individuals that were trained, that could be trained agents, but knew the language, knew the customs. They could provide the safe house in many cases that the team could hide in. So what they would do is they would go into a prisoner of war camp. They would specifically try to identify individuals that might have an axe to grind against the Germans. In many cases, it would be a communist, for instance, who was somehow forced to fight in the German army, or a man that had deserted deliberately, that may have expressed his views. And they would go in typically disguised as another German and just play off that they were just another POW. And they would do this for several days, which was dangerous, because if they were found out, they could probably be killed. But they would play along, and they would find out this person's intent. And this would, they had a number of ways to sort of suss out a volunteer that was legitimate. And you get some great individuals, and you get some individuals that aren't so great. For instance, Jack Taylor's mission, the individuals were okay, but their operational security was lacking, especially when they were trying to interact with the fairer sex, and that it actually helps blow the mission in their secrecy. So it's a fascinating story, and it's an untold, in many cases, really an untold aspect of World War II.
Well, thank you, Patrick O'Donnell. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause. Patrick will be outside at the book signing station. This is our first break, but most of you know the drill. If you buy 5 books, you get free shipping. So please enjoy the break. Go buy lots of books. Come back for 9:30 for our next session. Thank you very much.